Yeah, so I guess I wanted to start by addressing the room, right? Because I don't know what are the particular details of each person's political evolution. But if you're here, I assume that means you think we need a revolution. And that's probably for certain reasons, right? Just to name a few. We're living through the worst cost of living crisis in a generation, right? So 49% of Canadians polled said that inflation is the #1 worry in their life. And 55% of the country said described their situation as financially paralyzed. We have an unprecedented housing crisis, right? Raise your hand real quick. Let's take a poll. Who here believes that they will in their lifetime own a home? All right, Sam, that's fine. But I don't think that's very realistic. 88% of renters say that owning a home has become out of reach. And meanwhile, at a time when the majority of people live paycheck to paycheck, the rich are getting ever richer, right? Last year, Oxfam reported that the richest 1% of the world's population owns more wealth than 95% of humanity. Just one of the most egregious examples of this is recently, have you guys heard that Tesla is going to potentially pay out a $1 trillion payout to Elon Musk? So yeah, there's a widespread feeling that society is in decline. Ipsos polled people across 30 countries, and they found that 63% of people say their country is headed in the wrong direction. And that makes sense, right? In almost every country, there's a huge political crisis. You have intense polarization to the right and to the left, and you have a collapse of the status quo. But the decline goes a lot deeper than just the economic situation, right? Because there are also existential problems facing humanity. War spreads across the earth like a plague. For the last 2 years, everyone will probably be familiar, we've had the most live-streamed genocide in history with the full support of every Western government. But there are many other bloody conflicts around the world. Depending on how you count, actually, the number of armed conflicts raging the world right now is between 60 and over 120. But no matter what the number, it's the highest number since just after World War II. And under the pretext of a more dangerous world, right, even so-called peaceful Canada, our government is going to raise military spending to 5% of GDP. So if all that weren't enough, the climate crisis, I think, it weighs on everyone's minds, right? It gets worse every year, and all the governments of the world are sitting on their hands. Just one anecdote is that a couple weeks ago, they held the annual UN climate conference. And as if nature was trying to illustrate a point, at this climate conference in Brazil, a fire broke out at one of the pavilions. So yeah, capitalism now poses an existential threat to the very existence of human civilization. And I think this fact is dawning on many people, especially young people. And that's why revolutionary ideas are becoming more popular, right? It's not that communists are creating this mood. It's actually the inevitable result of the deepening crisis of capitalism. This is a system, it's a dying system. It's a system in decline, and there's no way to reverse its decline. And so all of this discontent, the frustration, the massive pressures building up in the depths of society, that's untenable at a certain point. The situation cannot last forever, and it will eventually produce huge social explosions, huge political shifts, mass movements bigger than anything we've seen in decades. And I think that what we're going to see is, in the future, a fundamental challenge to the capitalist system. And I think it's a very real possibility that we could see the overthrow of the capitalist system in our lifetime. But for Marxists, this is just the start of the question, right? Because that itself poses important questions that need to be answered. And that's why I'm doing this presentation. Because capitalism has been in a deep crisis before, right? There have also been revolutionary periods before, right? When capitalism was almost overthrown. And yet today, the capitalist system remains intact. And so, therefore, if we want to overthrow capitalism, if we want to carry out a revolution, we need to be able to answer the following questions. Why hasn't capitalism already been overthrown? How has revolution been successful in the past? And how can we prepare to ensure that a revolution in the future is successful? So, for some people, the reasons why capitalism hasn't been overthrown already really boils down to one thing. Well, two things, really. There's either the workers are not revolutionary, or the state is too strong, the system is too strong. So yeah, the argument takes various forms. The workers are too right-wing, they're too propagandized to accept the status quo, they're too comfortable, or they're too weak, they're too disorganized. And then the other side of it, right, the system is too strong. The state is too powerful, it has too much legitimacy, it has all of these weapons, it's not possible to overthrow it. So for either of these, the workers are too weak, the state is too strong, the conclusion that flows is this: the working class can't change society, right? Is this true? Well, I would say that it's the furthest thing from the truth. Because the truth is, in the last 100 years, there have been countless uprisings of the working class. You've seen times when millions of people rise up to change their conditions, to overthrow society, to try and take their destiny into their own hands. Just to name a few examples, you had the revolutionary wave in Europe after World War I. I won't name all the countries, but it was many. You had China in the 1920s, Spain and France in the 1930s, Europe again in France, Italy, Greece after World War II, the colonial post-war revolutions in Africa and Asia against imperialism. You had the revolutionary wave of the 1960s and the 70s that touched every continent, dozens of revolutions. The revolution in the 80s and the 90s against apartheid in South Africa, in Venezuela in the early 2000s, and then recently, of course, had the revolutions in the Arab world in 2011 to 2013. In 2019, you had a reawakening of this. A revolutionary wave swept Latin America, North Africa, and the Middle East. Countries like Chile, Lebanon, Ecuador, Colombia, Sudan. And then, as Stephanie mentioned, most recently, we've seen a huge revolutionary wave across the world, from Indonesia and Nepal to Madagascar to Peru. And here's a picture of the Nepalese masses burning down their parliament building. I don't know, I just like that. So it's, sweet. Anyway, in all of these cases, when the masses rose up, they were taking their destiny into their own hands. And in all of these cases, the ruling class was actually too weak to even challenge them. The truth is, the state does not have enough armed forces, enough legitimacy, or power to challenge the working class once it is mobilized and conscious of its own interests. Actually, often the armed forces even desert to the side of the revolution. So in all of these situations, it would have been entirely possible for the working class to take power and to carry out a socialist revolution. The working class didn't come to power in any of these revolutions. And it's not because the masses were too weak or because the state was too strong. There was something else, which I think it's the fundamental problem of revolution, which was the question of leadership. There was an inadequate leadership. And the role of leadership is decisive. It can make the difference between victory and defeat. In each of these revolutions, all of these times I've mentioned, almost every time, it's the leaders of the workers' movement, usually the leaders of the unions or the workers' parties, that exercise their authority to act as a brake, as a barrier to the movement. So often this takes the form of they make deals with the ruling class, they get certain promises of concessions, and then they call off the movement. They bring it to a halt. Or they directly sabotage the movement in order to prevent the overthrow of the system. That happens too. So I'll give a concrete example of this, which is Sudan in 2019. So in 2019, Sudan had lived under the same dictatorship for roughly 30 years. And since 2008, the economic situation had gotten much worse. And so by December of 2018, things hit a tipping point. The government tried to end subsidies for food and fuel. And in the whole context of years of crisis, years of austerity and poverty and massive unemployment, this was a tipping point. The masses had had enough, and you had a mass movement erupt calling for the fall of Omar al-Bashir, the dictator. And actually, it was so powerful that by April 2019, the ruling class had to relent. They had to remove the dictator. He had to step down. And the ruling class did this to placate the movement. But they kept the army in charge. And did it placate the movement? It didn't work. There was another general strike. There was a general strike, demanding that the military give up power. And the strike paralyzed the whole country. And so what did the state do in this context, right? Well, they couldn't use the army. So they sent in religious militias to attack the masses in the capital, Khartoum. There was a sit-in. So they tried to repress the movement. And that didn't work either, because there was another even bigger general strike. This time resistance committees popped up. Resistance committees is basically the masses self-organizing to organize the movement. I mentioned that they couldn't use the army. That's because the soldiers sympathized with the revolution. And so the army refused to fire on the people. And so all of the ingredients were there for the working class to take power, to take power over society and the economy into its own hands and to change society, right? You know, armed forces, they're sympathetic to the movement, the masses are self-organizing, the regime is paralyzed, all the ingredients are there. What happened? Well, the missing ingredient, as I mentioned, a decisive revolutionary leadership. The main leading organization of this movement was called the Sudanese Professionals Association. They had called both general strikes. To their credit, they'd given a really bold lead forward for the movement to a certain point. And so this organization had a lot of authority with the masses, right? It was, in effect, the leadership of the revolution. So what was the nature of this organization? Well, it's in the name, right? A professionals association is basically a middle-class organization, right? It had certain characteristics of a union. They organized lawyers, teachers, doctors, and stuff. But they didn't have a socialist program, and they had no vision of the working class taking power in society. They essentially had the goal of liberal democracy, right? And so because the leadership had no vision, had no concept that the working class could take power or should take power over running society, that meant that at the decisive moment, they compromised with the regime. So instead of calling for the organizing and the taking of power, they called off the strike, this second really powerful general strike, and they negotiated with the military, actually. This didn't result in democracy, spoiler alert. Instead, by holding back the movement, the revolution lost its momentum. And once the revolution had died down, the ruling class felt emboldened to go on the offensive against the masses. So the leaders of the SPA, they had negotiated with the military for a 3-year transitional period before elections would be held. But in 2021, the military leaders broke that promise, obviously, and they staged a coup. And since then, the country has descended into civil war, basically, between two warring armies. There's the official army, and then there's the religious fundamentalist army that I mentioned that they used against the revolution. They'd previously collaborated. These two sides are being backed by various imperialist powers competing over the country's resources. And as a result, Sudan has essentially collapsed. Since 2023, estimates range from as low as 150,000, which is a lot, to sometimes 500,000 people have been killed. And 12 million people have been displaced in a country of 50 million. Recently in the news, there's been reports of genocidal massacres being carried out in Darfur against the minority population. And I think we should be clear about what this is. This is the price that is paid for a failed revolution. Because years later, and for the foreseeable future, the people of Sudan are still paying, will continue to pay, the price for the failure of the working class to take power. Excuse me, water bottle. So we have to ask the question, why did the Sudanese revolution fail? Well, was it because the masses were not revolutionary enough? Well, if you know what they did, I don't see how you could possibly accept that as an explanation. The masses gave everything they could, and anything that could be asked of them. I would say it's because the leadership failed the test. Now you could ask the question, okay, if their leadership was bad, why did they not choose a different leadership? Why didn't they create a different leadership? But there has never been a revolution in history in which the masses could spontaneously construct the perfect organization, the perfect leadership to express their interests. On the contrary, it's always organizations, it's always leaderships that exist before the revolution that come to have an influence in it. And so where there are existing organizations that have authority, people tend to look to them for leadership. And so in a situation where these organizations are holding the struggle back, it's very difficult. I hesitate to say impossible, but it's very difficult for the masses to spontaneously invent a new organization and a new leadership on the spot. And I would say almost every defeated revolution in the last 100 years can be explained by the failure to build a revolutionary leadership in time to achieve victory. But there are positive examples because, we can ask the question, what does it look like when there is a revolutionary leadership built in advance? And I think that there's no better example than the Russian Revolution of 1917. This was the first socialist revolution in history, and it was the only workers' revolution to establish a workers' democracy, the democratic rule of the working class over society. And I would argue that this revolution is the best one that can serve as a model, as an inspiration for us today. So a bit of the context. By 1917, Russia had been living through World War I for roughly 3 years. 3 years in, this was a living hell for the masses, right? Hunger, bitterness, cold gripped the countries. In the factories, you had long hours and no food. Children starved in homes. Meanwhile, the soldiers at the front no longer wanted to fight for the regime. And so the status quo had become completely untenable. In February, that's the old calendar, it was actually March 8th, International Women's Day, the women workers of the capital, Petrograd, began a movement which developed into a general strike. And the soldiers came over to the side of the revolution, and after a week, the Tsar was forced to abdicate. He was forced to step down. Now, in this revolution, councils of soldiers and workers were formed with elected delegates from every regiment, from every factory. And these councils, famously, they're called the Soviets. Soviet just means council. These were elected mass organizations. They were representatives of the working class and of the soldiers. And this isn't peculiar to Russia, actually. There's a general lesson we can draw from this, because this kind of thing appears spontaneously in every revolution. You have spontaneously formed committees or councils from among the people, some form of self-organization to coordinate the struggle. So for example, in Sudan, you had the resistance committees. Now in Russia, what happened is that these organizations started to take over, just organically started to take over the functions of running society. And so essentially what you had was a situation where the Soviets were becoming the real power and authority in the country. And since they were running the country, they had the potential to take power, to establish a workers' government based on the Soviets. But this didn't happen automatically. Because actually, at the beginning of the revolution, the main parties that kind of were leading, or the leadership kind of fell into their lap, was the Social Revolutionary and the Menshevik parties. And these were essentially reformist parties. What do I mean by that? It's not that they wanted reforms. That's not a trait that's peculiar to reformists. The point is that they thought that the workers could arrive at a compromise with the capitalists. They thought that the demands of the masses, the reforms that they sought, could be achieved within the framework of the capitalist system. So they wanted to reform it, not overthrow it, right? Meanwhile, the capitalists, they formed their own government. It's called the provisional government. It essentially had no real support of its own. But the reformists were leading the Soviets, right? These organizations that were actually the real power. And they used that authority to keep this capitalist government in power. So this situation is, the leaders are using all their authority to keep the capitalists in power and prevent the working class from taking power. But the government was a government of capitalists. It couldn't satisfy any of the demands of the masses. And so over the course of the revolution, the Soviet leaders started to really discredit themselves. And at the same time, the capitalists and landlords are collaborating with the military, trying to find the perfect moment to strike, to try and put the revolution down, to restore order, you know? If the situation had continued for too long, it would have destroyed the revolution. Actually, probably it would have looked somewhat similar to what Sudan looks like right now. Why did the revolution succeed? What was the difference? The difference is there was an existing revolutionary alternative to these reformist parties. And this was the Bolshevik Party, led by Lenin. And this party had spent months explaining that it was necessary for the working class to take power in order to complete the revolution, in order to bring it forward. They had thousands of worker activists on the ground, in key workplaces, in every neighborhood and locality. And they were arguing incessantly arguing among the workers, among the soldiers, for this perspective. And it started small. I mean, the Bolsheviks were a small minority at the start of the revolution because the workers and the peasants, they overwhelmingly looked to the reformists, these people who seemed to offer an easier way out, right? The easiest way out. So how did the Bolshevik Party go from a small party of thousands to one with mass influence? Right? How did this party win leadership of the working class? Well, I would say that the fundamental thing is their approach. They skillfully engaged with the masses who had illusions in the reformists, right? They didn't just denounce the reformist leaders from the sidelines, right? Traitors, you're holding back the movement. Because the masses, the workers, the soldiers, they trusted these parties. So that would have just alienated them. It wouldn't have worked. So while the Bolsheviks were in a minority, their approach was they would patiently explain. They would explain what had to be done in order to achieve the demands of the masses. They're basically saying, if we want to end the war, if we want to give land to the peasants, if we want to solve the hunger crisis, then the working class must take power. So they essentially offered the reformist leaders their support in taking power. So you may have heard the slogan, if you take a history class, all power to the Soviets, you might not have realized that the Bolsheviks weren't raising with the slogan, yeah, all power to the Bolsheviks, like put us in power. They were saying the reformists should take power. Essentially, the Bolsheviks were saying to the masses, your leaders, they have a majority. They have a majority in the Soviets. They should take the power. If they do, they could carry out the demands of the revolution, peace, land, bread, right? And we will support this. And so the workers and the soldiers, they'd hear that and they'd think, okay, I'm not a Bolshevik, but yeah, I agree with that. Why? They should take power. Why don't they take power? But the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, right, the reformists, they did not want to take power. They wanted to keep the capitalist government in power. And so with this approach, the Bolsheviks skillfully put the reformist leaders in a position where if they tried to betray the revolution, they would be exposed in the eyes of the masses. And so over the course of the year, more and more workers and soldiers saw that the Bolsheviks were right. And so by October 1917, the Bolsheviks had won a majority in the Soviets. They'd won the confidence of the majority of the working class, and they carried out an insurrection. And for the first time in history, the working class came to power. All right. So we have to ask certain questions. Why did the Russian Revolution overthrow capitalism where many other revolutions have failed? Was it because the working class in 1917 was more revolutionary than the Sudanese working class in 2019? I would say no, that's not the case. The difference was the presence of the Bolshevik Party. The difference was, this party made the difference between victory and bloody defeat. The Bolsheviks didn't create the revolution, right? They couldn't have carried it out under any and all conditions. It was created by the crisis of capitalism. Trotsky explained this really well. He says, they accuse us of creating the mood of the masses. That is wrong. We only tried to formulate it. So yeah, what he's saying is that's the role of a revolutionary party, to formulate what the workers come to understand in a conscious or semi-conscious way through their own experience. And so in a revolution, the working class comes to understand its own power through collective struggle, right? It also learns really important lessons, lessons that you wouldn't learn in a normal period of history, right? About the nature of the capitalist state, the inability of the ruling class to run society in a way that serves the interests of the majority. And when the working class decides to strike, nothing runs. Everything comes to a halt. And so the logical conclusion is, right, if the workers make everything run, then we should take power. It should run society in our own interests. And actually, if revolutions went on without interruption, right, and kind of uninterruptedly and for an indefinite amount of time, the working class would actually always learn these lessons and it would always take power. We would already be living under communism by now. The problem is that a revolution doesn't last very long, right? It lasts maybe months or years. Revolution takes a colossal amount of energy, and the energy of the masses is not infinite. So the point is that the working class needs to learn these lessons, learn the need to take power, and become conscious of that need before the energy runs out. And so I want to draw an analogy here. Who here knows chemistry and is familiar with, maybe that's a weird question. It's okay, I know chemistry. Well, I'm not a chemist, but I'll try and draw an analogy here. In a chemical reaction, you can have, all the ingredients, you can have all the chemicals for the reaction to occur. But it can still take forever if you don't have a catalyst, right? That's like something to accelerate the process. The catalyst, it doesn't create the chemical reaction. What it does is it basically accelerates the process of their mixing together and accelerates the chemical reaction. And so I draw an analogy here. The party in a revolution is that catalyst. Its job is to accelerate the process of learning and to show the working class that the only way forward is the socialist revolution. In other words, the party has to win the working class, the majority of the working class, to its program, and then actually take power before that energy runs out. And so when a revolution doesn't have this catalyst, the energy tends to run out before the majority have come to understand this need, and then the process goes into reverse. The ruling class clamps down, and that's what happened in Sudan. And so that's why a revolutionary party with a correct program and strategy, it needs to be built years in advance to prepare for this eventuality. So the Bolshevik Party, because the Bolshevik Party wasn't built overnight, right? It actually required decades of patient work by thousands of dedicated revolutionaries. Right? Ultimately, the goal of a revolutionary party is to unite all movements against injustice and oppression into a single powerful movement to smash the capitalist system. But you can only do this by training a really solid core of people in Marxist theory. And so in the 1880s and the 1890s, the Russian Marxists began this process. They created study groups to educate small numbers of workers and students in the basics of Marxism. And these groups were isolated. They didn't really have much of an impact on the workers' movement, but they were very important to lay the foundations of what would later become an influential party in the working class, the foundation of the Revolutionary Party. And this is something Lenin recognized, right? And he laid out a plan to unite all of these smaller Marxist groups into a larger party. We have the book over there where he did that. In 1902, he published What is to be Done. It's a very good book. If you read it and you're familiar with these debates at the time and today, it actually reads like a polemic. Like, you could still apply this today. It reads like a polemic with various groups and tendencies in the movement. So what Lenin explained is that in order to unite Russian Marxism into a single party, we need to have extremely clear ideas. Just to quote him here, he said, "Before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. Otherwise, our unity will be purely fictitious. It will conceal the prevailing confusion." So in other words, if we want to build a powerful revolutionary force, then we really need to agree on goals and strategy. And that's the only way we can really be unified in practice. If you unite without really agreeing, you won't be able to actually do anything together. And I think this is an important lesson from the history of Bolshevism, right? The Bolsheviks actually spent the better part of 10 years in the same party as the Mensheviks. They were actually two factions of the same party. But these two factions had different political goals. They had different strategy. And so it was once the Bolsheviks split with the Mensheviks that they took off and attained huge influence in the working class. And it was precisely because they weren't unified with people who they didn't really agree with that they were able to become a much larger force and a much stronger force. And eventually this clarity, being freed up from those people who didn't really agree with them, is what enabled them to win the masses and carry out a revolution. And so, that's an important lesson. The most successful socialist revolution in history was led by a party that never watered down its ideas and never compromised on Marxism. And I think if we want to do the same thing, we need the same degree of ideological firmness. Now, Bolshevism is often presented as something that's like a relic of 100 years ago in Russia, right? It's only applicable to then. I would say this is the farthest thing from the truth. I would say this is exactly the kind of party we need today. Because fundamentally, what Bolshevism was a school to train up revolutionary leaders by rigorously training them in Marxism and participating in the workers' movement. And it's by training its activists in Marxist theory and the history of the revolutionary movement that the Bolshevik Party created thousands of people who could play a leading role and become real revolutionary leaders in the workers' movement. These are people who had a deep understanding of the world. They could link every injustice back to capitalism in a language that people could understand and connect with, and people who could show a way forward for the struggle, even under the most difficult conditions. And this is also important. They weren't just individual, isolated Marxists. They were part of a collective. They were part of a revolutionary party, and this allowed them to speak to the working class with one coherent voice. And so the Bolshevik activists actually became leaders of the workers' movement by building the party over many years. And at the same time, it was by building the party that they built themselves into people who could be leaders, who could play a leading role. So back to the present day. Canadian capitalism is in an existential crisis. You have massive government debt, you have a productivity crisis, and now Canada's biggest trading partner has turned against us. So how will the capitalists try and overcome this crisis? I would say it's the same way as always. They're going to try and make the working class pay for it. Mark Carney's recent budget, it contains something like 10% cuts to the federal workforce. And the Canadian business community saw this. They're like, it's not enough. It's not enough. You need to go way further. And so I think we can say pretty confidently that this government is only just getting started. And I think that they're going to slash they're going to make way bigger cuts. They're going to severely cut social services, healthcare, education, disability payments, public services, all of the things that make life livable. And I think this is going to provoke intense class struggle. The truth is, mass movements that we've never seen in Canada, could be just around the corner. And so I would say that historically speaking, the conditions for revolution are developing really quickly. But meanwhile, the leadership of the working class has never been more cowardly. So I'll give one example of this. You had a recent teacher strike, if any of you followed it, in Alberta. You had over 50,000 teachers went on strike in October for issues like reduced class sizes, more funding for education. And the Alberta government is a very reactionary government, the UCP. They tabled back to work legislation, including the notwithstanding clause. The notwithstanding clause basically means your constitutional rights don't matter because we said so. And so, basically, they tabled legislation that allows them to take away the right to strike and just impose a contract, like no negotiations even. Now, the labor leaders, they threatened that if the UCP did this, they might, they said, organize a general strike. This is because there was massive support for that in the population. In a survey, you had 51% of Albertans said they would support a general strike in this situation. You had the largest rally in the history of Alberta, 30,000 people in Edmonton. And also the Alberta Teachers Association is part of the Common Front, which represents over 300,000 workers in Alberta. And so very favorable conditions for a general strike. When the government passed the legislation, what did the union do? Did they defy? Did they call to defy the law? Did they call for a general strike? The president of the union got up and he said, we'll challenge the decision in the courts. And basically they sent the teachers back to work. So and the union wouldn't even allow the teachers to vote on whether or not they could defy the law. They said it was illegal, right? It's like, yeah, obviously. Anyway, this is one example, but there are many like it. The point is that the current leadership of the working class has proven itself completely unfit to play a revolutionary role. In the 1930s, Leon Trotsky wrote that the historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership. And that is still true today, I would say, and that's why we need to prepare. I'm almost done. So, last question. How could we carry out a revolution? How would we play a role in a future revolution in Canada? Actually, what would a revolutionary party do in a revolution? So let's frame a hypothetical scenario, right? And I want you to keep in mind as I'm describing this isn't really hypothetical. It's actually very concretely taken from the various different examples of revolutions that have happened over the last couple years. Okay, Mark Carney's second budget comes out this time next year. It's announced. It contains massive attacks on social services, wages, healthcare, pensions, benefits, and the right to strike. In the context of a deep recession, after years of decline and crisis, this is a step too far for people, and you have a huge mass movement erupt across the country. So you have mass demonstrations in major cities, especially involving students. The government tries to use, repression. They try and send in the police. They send in the RCMP. That just inflames things, provokes things, makes it worse. In response, the students call on the workers to strike in solidarity, and you have a general strike, paralyzes the country, and you have huge scenes of spontaneous self-organization on campuses and in workplaces across the country. Now, in this situation, how would a party of, let's say 5,000 capable Marxists, how would it connect with this mood and become a visible force in the movement? Well, communists would participate in every form of existing organization. You'd participate in the mass meetings, in the strike committees, the student occupations, but you would bring a socialist program to this. You'd be constantly raising the question, what is the next step forward for the movement? And what do we ultimately have to do in order to succeed, in order to achieve our goals? Maybe that's in a concrete situation, the occupation of key workplaces, maybe organizing self-defense groups, right, against the police. Or strengthening and linking up these self-organized committees on a national level to provide a unified national leadership for the struggle across the country. Now, the demands of any revolution often start very modest, right? And it would probably start aimed at, in this hypothetical scenario, the budget, right? The concrete measure that the movement is opposing. But as the movement became bigger and stronger, it would naturally go further. And the demands would become much more radical. They become down with the government, right? And the movement could take on an insurrectionary character. And in this context, the goal of the party would be to use the experience of the class struggle to make the working class conscious of its own collective strength and its ability to run society in its own interests. We would constantly explain, right? If we want to guarantee the right to a decent life, if we want to defeat the budget, but if we want to ensure that something like this never happens again, the working class must control society. And we would explain concretely in the given scenario how we could achieve that. And in these conditions, a party of thousands could grow to become tens or hundreds of thousands, and it could become a real mass force. And a party of that size could win the majority of the working class, and it could guide the struggle to victory. Now, all of this is possible, right? What I've just outlined. But the reality is, right now, that party does not exist. It does not yet exist. This is what we're trying to build in the Revolutionary Communist Party. But we're not yet 1,000 members across the country, right? So if a revolution broke out next year, we would be too small to achieve a great influence on it. So our first task is to grow bigger. And we can do that by reaching and recruiting the people who have already come to revolutionary conclusions now. And so that's why, those of you who are not already part of the Revolutionary Communist Party, I would urge you to join. Help us build this party into a serious force that is recognized by the working class, right? Because once we've achieved the first few thousand, I think we will start to become a force that's really visible in society. We can play more of a role in the workers' movement. We can provide leadership to demonstrations and to campaigns. And our voice will be heard by millions of people. We'll be able to win over much larger sections of society. And I think that, look, a group of a few thousand, that's still quite small. But the point is that in a time of mass upheaval and revolution, a small group with the right ideas and the right methods can become a much larger force. Because that's what revolution is. People are learning through their experience of daily life at that point that, those Marxists were right, basically. To give just one famous example, in February of 1917, the Bolsheviks had only 8,000 members in the entire country of 150 million people. And most people in Russia had never heard of them. But by October, they had 400,000 members, and they had the support of the majority of the country. And there are many other examples of this, of small groups becoming much bigger. Now, I would say that history itself is again creating the conditions for a small Marxist force to emerge as a mighty and a powerful factor in the situation. But we're in a race against time. So if we want to do what the Bolsheviks did, if we want to succeed in that, then that depends on the work that we do now. And if we can succeed in building a revolutionary party with thousands of skilled Marxists in time to play a role in the coming revolutionary period, then I think we can change the course of world history. Thanks.